I work for Fortinet. I've been in the IT industry embarrassingly for 32 years, which, well, let's not talk about that because I'll just start crying. But what we're going to try and do in this brief session is just talk through some of the background, some of the context around why things like reconnaissance are particularly important and valuable in terms of demonstrably dropping the risk that you'll have within your organizations. So let's see if the clicker works. State of the nation. Let's talk through that first of all. A couple of examples as to why we're in the place that we are right now in terms of risk, in terms of vulnerabilities, and why therefore all of you are here in the audience today looking at ways to try to demonstrably drive your risk within your organizations down. Let's talk about last Patch Tuesday. Microsoft released over 80 patches. There were a number of them that had a particularly worrying set of potential exploits. One of the examples that I think is particularly relevant is that of a vulnerability within the Outlook application. Now, this particular vulnerability, by simply receiving an email to your computer without even looking at it, without even acknowledging that you'd actually received it, by the simple fact that Outlook had accepted it into the database, that itself could have actually compromised your computer and allowed remote code exploits to happen driven by an attacker. So the point being that we're in a place where you don't need to interact with your computer. There are absolute vulnerabilities that could be exploited that require zero human interaction at all, which arguably gets past the part of the psychological point that we heard earlier, but it's important, I think, that we were talking about psychology earlier because clearly that's a huge aspect as well. Let's talk about the bug bounty. The industry of ransomware is so well versed now and so mature that the actual attack groups are blatantly offering money to the rest of the world to make their ransomware better quality. Just as we've seen with the likes of all of the main software manufacturers, now we're seeing ransomware groups say, we'll give you between $1,000 and $1 million if you help make our ransomware better. So it shows really that the industry of crimeware as a service is absolutely mature and it is a huge problem. Let's talk about the lightning stealer. Now this was last year, but I think it's particularly relevant because again, it very much plays to the psychology of choice. All of the people in this room, I guarantee all of you will have picked a browser that you're using based upon a perception of speed, brand loyalty, look and feel, etc., etc., etc. It doesn't matter. Every single browser that you have a choice to use is being attacked by the attack groups, and when they are successful, they remove a lot of data that ultimately introduces risk to you as individuals and to the companies that you work for. And clearly, there's regulatory pressure. I think this is worth referencing. We've got the Digital Operational Resilience Act, which is aimed at the financial sector and ultimately is aimed at making sure that all of us as consumers can expect things to work 24/7, 365 by pushing the operational resilience responsibility, understandably, to the providers. We've obviously got GDPR, and we've now got the Consumer Duty Act, which is all around the necessity to protect the vulnerable people in society, whether they're people who've got a gambling problem or some other sort of, they're financially vulnerable, making sure that the fintech sector can identify those people and ensure they are looked after and protected against making inappropriate decisions. So we talked about, well, the previous the speaker talked about deepfakes. One of the things that Fortinet do every year is we announce a forecast for the following year in terms of cybersecurity, and we did this in late November last year. Let's talk about the whole deepfake use on the rise. I would theorize what is to stop an attack group copying or recording the audio on an annual results call or a quarterly results call for a publicly traded company where the CFO and the CEO talk about the results of that organization. What is to stop an attack group recording that, running it through an auditory sort of deepfake engine, and then getting those individuals to say whatever they want them to say, and wrapping that within a social engineering scheme, a spear phishing campaign, a copy of a website to create brand reputation and brand sort of capability as part of that attack? There's nothing to stop them doing that. So I think I completely agree with the previous speaker. We're going to see a much bigger issue with deepfakes, both audio and video based. Reconnaissance as a service is worth talking about as well. We're estimating we're going to see more of that this year, and that's all around furthering what we saw last year with the attack groups, where they basically use agile development. They throw out a load of individual code requirements to a group of people. They subcontract those individual pieces of code. They then take those pieces and assemble them like Lego, and then they've got a working exploit to aim at the vulnerability that they want to aim it at. So ultimately, what does that do? That enables them to launch more attacks more quickly in a more sustainable and more successful fashion, which therefore increases the payday and decreases the time to payday. And there's a variety of other things that we're estimating. And I think maybe the final point worth making on this slide is we are already seeing more wiper-based malware. Now, this was given a shot in the arm at the start of last year because of the Ukrainian conflict, because both sides were creating ransomware that ultimately operationally destroyed the devices that they infected. And now we've got the situation where that is accelerating, and what we're seeing is, and we're estimating we're going to see even more of it, more wiper-based malware, both deliberately, but it's also worth mentioning it could be accidental, because we're seeing things like, again, ChatGPT was talked about before. Those of you who haven't played with ChatGPT at the moment, I'd thoroughly encourage you to. It's hilarious, but also it's very worrying, because we're seeing hackers that don't have the skill sets actually using AI to generate malicious code. Sometimes that works well, sometimes it does not. And the result of that is, so we've seen examples where ransomware has successfully infected devices, but then the attackers have forgotten to put in the ransom demand. So your computer is, well, it's broken, isn't it? So let's, come on. There we go. Let's not forget, though, that the Lockheed Martin kill chain that I believe was created around 2011, all this is, of course, is a common sense approach that the attackers will take to achieve their objectives. They will perform reconnaissance to understand the size of the prize. They will weaponize the knowledge they got from that reconnaissance. It could be technical, it could be social engineering, it could be scoping out a target on Facebook, understanding where they drink on a Friday afternoon, bumping into them, creating a conversation, asking questions. Humans are naturally predisposed to being honest, so reconnaissance can take all forms. And then looking to deliver the information based upon the weaponized knowledge they've got, and ultimately, through exploitation installation, achieving command and control, so you get persistence of communication to the back-end attack group, you achieve the action on objectives. So the point being that, yes, the threats are getting significantly more complex and more intelligent and more professional, but it still comes back to breaking the kill chain in as many places as possible, in as sustainable way as possible, to drive a better, more positive security posture within organizations. And part of that journey, it comes down to maturity. So it's very important to recognize that, and this is an overused comment, security is not a destination, it's a journey. I mean, it is absolutely a journey. As we all recognize, it's a cyclical journey, and it's understanding the risk-benefit analysis to ultimately create the ability to put a security posture in place within your organizations that's relevant to your organization and cost-effective for your organization. So it's important to look at all the different sets of ingredients and pick them in a way that fits your business and addresses the risks that your businesses are looking for. One of the things that's critical in terms of managing the cost base that clearly you're looking at in this journey is that of maximizing existing investments. And I think one of the things that we in Fortinet are particularly strong at is enabling customers to get value from what they've already bought. Because if you've got an open ecosystem and an open ability to integrate with other solutions from other manufacturers to ultimately create an easier set of automation, an easier ability to extend your visibility across your organization without wasting what you've already spent, that's critical. Otherwise, we're in a conversation of, well, you've got to replace that, and maybe you bought it 6 months ago and you signed a 3-year deal. That's not the right way to do this. It's absolutely critical to look at the ways that you can sweat your existing assets and maximize those investments within the context of achieving that security posture. So let's just talk about the top areas for consideration. I guess now we've sort of built the back-end context. Reconnaissance is incredibly important. As we talked about, we're estimating there'll be more reconnaissance as a service within the attack groups, accelerating their paydays, increasing their paydays. So understanding what's happening within your network and externally to your network from a reconnaissance perspective is critical. And as has been said, that generally will not be wasted effort because it will allow you to respond more intelligently, more contextually, and crucially, more quickly. So understanding reconnaissance is critical. And when I'm talking about reconnaissance, I'm talking about the likes of using deception or alarm sensors within your infrastructure. So if someone trips an alarm sensor, if someone pings a server that they shouldn't be pinging, then you've got that knowledge that someone's inside your network way before you would actually normally discover it. And externally, understanding what's happening with the attack groups. Are they planning an attack? Have they copied your website? Have they copied your applications that maybe you've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars creating for Apple devices and Android devices? Have they already copied your user database, and is it actually for sale on the dark web already? All of that reconnaissance information can help you react in a better way, in a much more sustainable way. Client behavior, I think it's worth calling that as well, because it's complementary to reconnaissance. Because since, of course, the pandemic and the whole hybrid working, I'm pretty certain if I asked for a show of hands as to who wants to go to the office 5 days a week, I'm pretty certain very few people would put that. Okay, we've got 2 people at the back who are very brave, who just put their hands up saying they want to go to the office 5 days a week. That's good, we like that. But clearly the hybrid working is here to stay. And the challenge is with all of the vulnerabilities we're seeing, working at home using a router that ultimately has been designed to a price point, you are inherently more vulnerable than if you were sitting behind a corporate enterprise-grade firewall in your office. That is a simple fact. And I've had this conversation with friends, and there's one particular one that really doesn't want to believe me. But that's the reality. You're at risk. So client behavior, both from a user interacting with the device, so maybe someone resigns and then all of a sudden they're copying the user database down. That's important to understand, but it's also important to understand way beyond classic antivirus, and I'm talking the sort of the obvious EDR side here, the behavior at the operating system level, the behavior that addresses the risks that we're seeing now. We're seeing scenarios where a secure boot can be compromised, so therefore we're getting very close to the point where we can't trust the end devices, which is why behavioral understanding down at that OS level is more critical than ever before. Antivirus, everyone says it, it's absolutely true. Antivirus is no longer good enough. And knowing what we've seen before is not a good precursor to being able to protect us in the future. So visibility, I think it's very important, going back to the earlier point, understanding across your entire infrastructure, regardless of vendor, picking solutions that give you the visibility, that lower the gaps between solutions. So ultimately, again, going back to the reconnaissance point, you can make better decisions more sustainably to protect your organization. And that's the sort of the SIEM and the SOAR tools, but making sure, to the previous slide, that you've got complete vendor openness so that it's not going to cause you a problem regardless of what you choose as you adjust your IT strategy moving forward. Automation, we're seeing automation. The best example of automation I've seen has nothing to do with cyber. It's the scenario where an ultra-high net worth individual's estate, we have a partner who actually offers this service. The car comes up to the gate, the camera looks at the car, checks the color, checks the size, optically recognizes the number plate. Then you've got a non-contact piece of gauging camera that looks at the exhaust fumes, calculates through the particulates the size of the engine, and then a feed from iCloud calculates that the children's phones are in the back seat and the chauffeur's phone is in the front seat. And if all of that lines up, the SOAR solution will open the gates. So the point being, you can automate anything and everything if you can take an IP feed from it and issue an instruction to it, regardless of vendor, regardless of use case. It's just a case of thinking about what the art of the possible is. And yes, we can even order pizzas using SOAR. So what's to stop in a security operations center, checking the number of people that are in there through sensors, through the building management system, correlating that with a number of outstanding calls that are on the automatic call distribution system, and if they breach certain levels, automatically issuing an order for Domino's Pizza. Why wouldn't you do something like that? You can automate anything and everything. So I'm conscious I'm probably over time, aren't I? So if I can have maybe 120 more seconds? Fantastic, thank you. I think that's going to cost me that. So let's just briefly go back to the point I made about deception, because deception, every single time we talk to customers and partners about deception, we generally get a very, very positive response, because it's one of those things that isn't talked about as much as it should be within our industry. But why is deception value? Well, I would argue that deception is exactly the same as having a home alarm. Why would you put 5 locks on your front door and not put a lock on all your windows? Deception helps answer that question. It helps create sensors across your entire network that in an ideal world will never trip. But if they do trip, then you've absolutely got information you would never have had prior to maybe data being exfiltrated. So therefore, you can respond more intelligently. And it absolutely reduces the dwell time. It enables organizations to address that risk where the speeds and feeds are getting faster and faster. The time we have to respond is getting lower and lower. It allows organizations to match that challenge. And then external posture, we talked about this earlier on in terms of understanding if you've got scenarios where your data's already been copied out of your organization, understanding if attack groups are actually planning an attack against your organization. Has your website being copied, and is it being hosted in a geography that has lower levels of sort of cyber legalities? All of that side of things, understanding the reconnaissance and what's happening on the dark web and on the open web allows organizations to take the internal knowledge they've got for their infrastructures, marry that up with external knowledge, and make better decisions. So, closing thoughts. Hopefully, we've covered this today. So it's all about the kill chain. It's all about the common sense approach that ultimately attackers will take. And it's about breaking that kill chain in as many places as possible in a sustainable, supportable, auditable way that plays to the regulatory things we've talked about, that play to the time to detect and the time to remediate. And yes, it's a list of things. The point being, it's about creating and understanding the right solutions, going back to that maturity slide we had earlier, making the right decisions for organizations at the right time, at the right level of cost, so that you can drive your time to detect down and your time to remediate down. And those ultimately are the 2 most critical metrics that I think give us the biggest challenges nowadays. So conscious of time, so I'll finish there, and thank you very much for your attention.